discuss on disaster resilient infrastructure, opportunities and challenges, I welcome His Excellency Sulaiman Hassan, Honorable Minister of State for Power, Works and Housing, Nigeria, as Chair, and Mr. Junaid Kamal Ahmad, Country Director, World Bank, as Co-Chair on the dais. The member of National Disaster Management Authority, Shri Kamal will be delivering the presentation. I hand over the floor to Chair for further deliberations.
My co-chair, the country director of the World Bank, Mr. Junaid Kamal Ahmad, Kamal Kishore, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We are here today united for a purpose. The theme, disaster resilient infrastructure, opportunities and challenges. We all are in agreement of the centrality of infrastructure development in promoting economic growth. We are faced in our different communities with various and varied disasters, ecological, geological, and man-made disasters of different magnitude. Investment in infrastructure comes with a huge financial cost. Maintaining same is again added economic burden on our states and societies. Coming from Nigeria, our experiences in provision of infrastructure, be it road, rail, telecommunications, power, marine, have always been government funded, which is highly inadequate. From our independence to date, the investments, like I said, have been from government funding, so maintenance is again a problem, not factoring the growth rate of our population, which of course is wearing out on the infrastructure that we have. But this government of President Muhammadu Buhari have devised another means of funding infrastructure. We have of recent floated a bond, the Sukuk bond, for 100 billion, which was oversubscribed to 106 billion. The fund is to finance road infrastructure all over Nigeria, shared in equal amount of about 16.67 billion per political zone, so that we can provide road infrastructure. We have, in the same manner, invested so much in other sectors to do the power sector. We have also invested in our navigable waterways, which are affected by flooding. And so a lot of the waterways are no more navigable, which comes with huge economic costs. And of course, again, the environment is also affected because of these floods and so on. So we again have just come out of the Boko Haram insurgency, which took its tolls on infrastructure, schools, hospitals, clinics in the Northeast sub-region, which again had direct bearing on the lives of our citizens. So it is with great pleasure when we got the invitation to attend this workshop, on disaster resilient infrastructure, of which we will take very good lessons back home. May I at this moment now invite Mr. Kamal Kishore to make a short introductory presentation. Thank you.
Very good morning to all of you. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I'll try to make up at least some time. Thank you, Chair, Co-Chair. This morning, when we started this discussion, in the hallway meeting you, a lot of people said that, well, this is a new area of work, and I think I want to start by contesting that it is not really a new area of work. In our region, if you look at Indus Valley civilization and see the kind of urban storm drainage they had, they would be a subject of envy for many of our so-called modern cities. This is a picture from Spain. This is a dam which was built in 2nd century. It fed the Roman aqueducts for several hundred years. It is still in use. So a piece of infrastructure which has been operational for 1800 years. A Roman aqueduct which still stands. It was built in 1st century AD, and till 19th century it was actually providing water to the town of Segovia. So this is what the human beings have been capable of. Closer home, Honorable Minister made the mention of this. The city of Udaipur, built in 16th, 17th century, a very complex system of interconnected lakes. They are all man-made lakes, and they have helped the city tide over floods and drought for centuries. It is getting stretched a little bit, but still serving very well our people. So you can see this, how one lake connects to the other, a very sort of regional approach to development of this very important infrastructure. In Karnataka, there is still currently operational network of 108 ponds built at different elevation through a very complex network of drainage channels. Not a drop of water that falls in that area is wasted. It still works. So this is what we are capable of. But sadly, things are changing. I don't know if you read New York Times. 3 weeks ago, we had a story called The World's Fastest Sinking City. This is a story on Jakarta. If you are interested, you should really read it. It's a massive, long story. And why Jakarta is sinking is not only because of climate change. Climate change is the reason, but also over-extraction of groundwater aquifers, blocking of drainage channels, blocking of rivers, and so on. The threat is that a third of the city could be displaced in a matter of 20 years if some drastic actions are not taken. So this is what we were. This is where we are, the point at which we are. You already see that there are parts that are sinking. So in this transition, I just wanted to highlight 5 drivers of the infrastructure transition that is currently taking place in the world. The first, of course, is the urbanization process. In 2007, the humanity crossed a point where more people live in urban areas than in rural areas. Look at the scale of a city, the scale of urbanization. This is 2 maps from Chennai, 1980 and 210, from all blue to all red in just a matter of 30 years. And when you have so many people, such an urbanized region, then it also places other demands on infrastructure. So let me just highlight that with an example. You see a strip there, an airstrip. This is in 2000, just 17 years ago, just barely touching the river Adyar. But when the airport has more demand, more people have to go through airports, you extend the airstrip and claim the river. And in a good year, river wants it back. This is what happened in December of 2015. It was not the only reason. There was extreme rainfall, but at least partly this was the reason. And now one of the proposed solutions is to propose a reinforced concrete perimeter wall around it. So we create risk, and then we try to reduce risk. Can we do it differently to stop creating new risk to the extent possible? The second driver of infrastructure transition is the interdependency of systems. One thing affects the other. No infrastructure system is independent. This is a graph which shows transportation, electric power, natural gas, telecom. Any disruption in one will affect the others as well. Very difficult to model, very difficult to predict, very difficult to quantify. This is an example from 2003, power blackout in southern Italy. A tree fell on some transmission line. And within a matter of 24 hours, all of southern Italy was under blackout. Not just Italy, but adjoining countries were also badly affected. How do we design systems that that kind of vulnerability is not there? Here, another point, besides the regional dimension, there is also systems dimension. When electricity goes down, the internet systems go down. When internet system goes down, it's very difficult to bring back electricity system up, the codependency both ways. So it's not just regional, it's also systems interdependence. And this is something we didn't deal with. The Romans did not deal with to the extent we are dealing with 2,000 years ago. And the issue of scale. There is this graph, a UNISDR analysis of global infrastructure outlook, and you see a growing gap between what is needed. The red line is what is needed, blue is what you have. But my contention is that even if we just follow the blue line, even if we work with deficit, do we have the capacity to build that, spend that blue line money in a manner that we build resilience? The answer veers towards a no. That was projection. This is history from 1992 to 2013, just in India. This is actual investment in different sectors. You see the red, which is energy. You see the blue, which is transport, and then telecom. So huge growth. And if you project it to now, it is still further going up. Metro projects. All the red dots in this slide, they are new under construction metro projects. In 10 years, the length of metro lines in India will be 6 times of what it is today. Highway length will be 1.5 times national highways by 2025. Our electricity generation is projected to double in 10 years. So that is the kind of scale we are dealing with. Then the fourth driver is that there are new players in infrastructure development. Junaid, in his opening remarks this morning, talked about capital markets. There are some infrastructure developers, financiers here who will tell you that the whole traditional paradigm of financing infrastructure is changing very rapidly. There are more players. There are more players in building infrastructure, financing infrastructure, operating and maintaining infrastructure. So multitude of players dealing with a very high level of complexity now. And of course, this is an issue for both developing and developed countries, replacing the old infrastructure. If you're driving, if you are in India and if you're going from Kalka to Shimla, all the bridges that the train line carries are not more than 100 years old. They're way past their life cycle. And how do we rebuild all of that? Countries like Japan and Australia and the US, they are at a stage where they're like 100-year-old infrastructure. All of that needs to be rebuilt, retrofitted, replaced. So these are the 5 big drivers of transition that we are seeing in infrastructure sectors. Now I want to dwell a little bit on what are the costs of not investing in resilience. The numbers that I'm going to show you pertain to only the countries present in this room, aggregate numbers, and they are highly conservative. They are taken from CRED data. They do not take into account the secondary order impacts such as an earthquake, a tsunami, and a nuclear disaster in Japan. They're just direct impact, very, very conservative. And the countries present in this room alone for the period 2005 to 2014 on an average have suffered $39 billion a year. And country director of India here will bear me out. This is the same order of magnitude that the World Bank disperses in a whole year for the entire world. So what the bank spends around the world in just these countries we are losing, and this is a lucky decade. This is 2005 to 2014. Remember, the tsunami happened on 26th December 2004, so that big event is not here. Other outlier events are not here as well. So the kind of losses we are having, this is a very conservative estimate. And this is a lucky decade, and if you look at an estimation of risk, Global Assessment Report, ISDR 2015, Andrew Maskry is sitting here, it's 4 times of what we see in the actual losses. So huge, the kind of risk that this room owns is massive. And as against the total losses, how do the infrastructure losses stack up? Let's look at a few examples. Indonesia, 2004, Aceh, 56% of the total losses, public losses, were due to infrastructure. I'm not talking about schools and hospitals, big infrastructure. Samoa, in recent years, 2/3 of the losses were in infrastructure. Nepal, 1/3, just a few years ago, 3 years ago. Fiji, 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, half the losses were due to infrastructure losses. So massive losses, and this is a table of 10 disasters. They are not the biggest disasters necessarily, but they are major ones. So we talk about these big disasters, but what about small and medium scale disasters? We also have this happening. Bridge hasn't collapsed. It has eroded, just one part of it has collapsed. So technically we haven't lost the infrastructure, but we've lost its functionality. And the degradation, subsequent degradation, successive degradation, the kind of impact that has is also enormous. So what can we do? I think that for infrastructure development in general, we do not have a comprehensive risk management framework which looks at risks of the future, risks of the now, uncertainties, how different systems are connected, and how are we going to manage that risk. So we have to work towards developing a risk management framework. There is a need to take a territorial approach. This is an example from Netherlands, how different pieces of infrastructure, and Case will talk about it later today, how they come together, how they are interconnected, taking a regional approach. In my own country, if you're going to build 10,000 kilometers of national highways, you're going to change the landscape of the country. You can't just look at that piece of infrastructure in isolation. You have to look at what is happening. So there is really a huge role for planning and a territorial approach to infrastructure development. A system of systems approach, I will not explain this in detail. We have colleagues from the UK talking about UK infrastructure transitions. How do you look at systems of systems? How do you do an infrastructure assessment, not by individual infrastructure sector, but an integrated fashion? And above all, there are lots of systems that have been working very well. We have to make every effort we can to preserve those existing systems. This is example of wetlands on the eastern side of Calcutta, which works very well in terms of, as a sort of catchment when excess rainfall happens, as a reservoir when excess rainfall happens, but also a natural system of, treatment of some of the sewage. But all of that is coming under threat because cities are expanding and they are eyeing those wetlands. So how do we sort of move beyond a very conventional approach of reclaiming wetlands to actually valuing them and preserving them to the extent we can? So in that respect, basically, we have identified 4 areas of work. I'm not going to go into any detail because that's what is the subject of the whole 2 days. The whole area of assessing risk, how do we assess risk not just to infrastructure but also emanating from infrastructure? How are we going to deal with uncertainties associated with climate change? How are we going to do cost-benefit analysis over the entire life cycle of infrastructure? I think that there's a whole range of issues we need to discuss. And how that understanding of risk is going to determine the kind of standards we are going to adopt. We are doing a preliminary analysis of standards in our own country, and basically there are three kinds. One is very well-established building codes, and then you have the second category where there are professional associations developing, which we are adopting, and the third is we are basically just taking standards from other countries. So to some extent, it appears that the standard setting is yet to catch up with infrastructure development to the fullest extent. And in that whole process, how do we regulate professions that are involved in it? How do we regulate the profession of engineering, profession of financiers of infrastructure, and so on? So that is a big chunk of work that we need to do. Thirdly, financing. As I said, financing has new players. How do we structure financing in a way that it encourages resilience? Reconstruction and recovery, a predictable mechanism to support recovery of infrastructure, minimize disruption, and so on. We will have the next 2 days to discuss this. Above all, it's a commitment we've made globally in 2015, which was a momentous year in the human history. At least 5 sustainable development goals, 9 explicitly mentions infrastructure, but the others too, at least 5 sustainable development goals talk about infrastructure. And once you do those 5, you leverage progress in other goals as well. Same goes for Sendai framework. We have 4 loss reduction targets, and the 4th one talks about infrastructure. And as Dr. Mishra said this morning, we can't achieve reduction in mortality, reduction in economic losses, reduction in number of affected people if we do not do a good job of reduction in losses to infrastructure. To do all of this, you need to have resilient infrastructure, you need an intellectual infrastructure, and these are, I think, almost all the organizations in this room. So I would like to say that the intellectual infrastructure to actually deliver on this, deliver on the promise, is right here in this room. And we have a choice whether to lock in risk or resilience. In my slide, risk is fading out. I hope that turns into reality. Thank you very much.
Kamal, thank you very much. Listening to the Honorable Minister of State from Nigeria and then listening to Kamal, I think there is a very clear message. We don't live in a world of we build infrastructure, manage infrastructure, and then there's a world of resilience. Our challenge is to bring the two together. One of the things that I learned in visiting the Netherlands is watching how the Netherlands has actually built its whole water infrastructure around the notion of resilience. Now it has to. It's a nation that's below the sea. So if it doesn't build an infrastructure that deals with water, managing the risks of water, its survival is at stake. But it's fascinating. There are places where the Netherlands has areas where the river can breathe. So when you have flooding, there actually land that is agreed which will be allowed to flood. So you avoid the destruction of the floods elsewhere. That's embedding resilience into planning infrastructure for economic growth, right? So I think that this room has a real challenge. This room is not full of members of Ministry of Finance. This room is not full of ministries of infrastructure, because I would argue that resilience is seen as a niche product, an environmental product, or resilience is seen as a disaster management after the effect happens. So this room has a real challenge of trying to embed resilience into day-to-day planning of nations. How does that happen? And I think Kamal's PowerPoint and presentation makes the point we live in a world with new drivers in which resilience has to be embedded in there. So let's open up the conversation and hear from you. First of all, I think your reactions to what you have heard and your sense of how we can actually bring resilience into the mainstream. So let's have some comments, some questions that you can raise for the next 2 days. So let's make this a consultative, participatory sessions. The request will be targeted comments as opposed to long interventions. So who will be the bold one? Please. Quick introduction, who you are, and then your quick comment.
My name is Bilal Ayoub. I'm professor of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Maryland, USA. I think there are two major constraints. One is commitment of organizations and countries, and meaning it will, the needs will rise up to the level where resources will be allocated. And the second one is finance. Sometimes we saw in the presentations that the requirements in terms of dollar amounts is quite sizable. How can we deal with financing things? Thank you.
So commitment of the nations and finance, two issues that have been brought up. Any other comments? Please.
Good morning. I'm Dr. George Thomas from Insurance Institute of India. I've been associated with these efforts from the insurance side for quite some time. I would like to flag one major area for discussion as the ex-ante pricing mechanisms, that is focusing on insurance, and any other manners, there's any other manner in which we can address disaster. I feel that insurance should be embedded into the entire framework of creating resilience. That is, whether it is at a large level, at a big infrastructure level, which is of the, where all the major investors are there, and also down at the bottom level, that is infrastructure for the fishermen, the infrastructure for the vulnerable populations at the bottom of the pyramid. For them, there won't be big financial stakes. That is from the country's point of view, but from the people perspective, these are things which are often forgotten. Where we need to work around, maybe around creating mutuals, creating MCCOs, that is the community-based solutions. From there to, from the community-based solutions at a very local level for the poorest, to the big infrastructure level, there is lots which can be done and which need to be done. I wish I should flag this. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask Christophe, where are you? Christophe, can I ask you this? We hear this often when it comes to finance. There's an issue, insurance markets. Can insurance markets play a role? Can you just give us a sense from the global perspective, how big is an insurance market emerging in the world today, given the resilience issues? Just, can you give us a sense?
Samantha, who from our disaster risk financing group, can give you maybe better numbers or so, but overall what we are facing is the challenge is that the insurance market, is basically more developed in the kind of advanced economies. So insurance for more low capacity countries, we don't have much kind of a penetration there. And that comes to the other point of, that's also an issue about knowledge. Insurance market cannot be developed without the knowledge about the vulnerability and what kind of assets at stake. Having this kind of knowledge, then you can basically also build better risk financing systems around. So I think part of this initiative we are thinking about resilient infrastructure, and I think there was already the comment, as you mentioned, insurance or risk financing has to be a central part. But I think it cannot be without investing in the necessary data structure in order as a background, and also then in the policy environment for insurance to operate. Because it's also not a very politically attractive element to introduce risk-based premiums and financing. We have seen insurance products in countries where the political economy was very difficult to convince the community, and that goes also back. So basically, I would say it's more on the more developed countries, and it's basically not very visible right now in the low capacity environment.
Can I get anyone from any of the countries, Are there examples from your countries where government has actually begun to help, in effect, an insurance market to grow? Because, Christophe, what you have said is unless you have a basic information base about the risk profile, you're not going to get a market emerging. And even then, government may have to put some kind of a shareholder investment to grow. Are there examples that people could refer to where insurance markets are growing or how government is trying to sponsor? Please.
I am Dr. Amalnathan, representative from Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan government has introduced disaster special insurance scheme from last year. Past year, government of Sri Lanka has allocated about 300 million for pre-insurance purpose. In the year 2017, we have allocated 500 million Sri Lankan currency. The difficult part is that Sri Lanka is continuously affected by disaster. Within last 2 years period, we have faced major 9 disasters. In the year 2017, government of Sri Lanka has elected company only 500 million. Particular insurance company has paid over 4,000 million. This is the critical issue to reinsure particular insurance company. Now that company is facing very difficult to handle this ambiguous situation.
I think sort of one hypothesis to be tested out in the next 2 days is whether the insurance market is not the tail that's wagging the dog, that in the coming years, a growth of an insurance market may not be that big a financing story because you have a lot of challenges to develop. And also talking about insurance market at the household level, such as farmers versus fishermen versus the larger, more macro. Sir.
Thank you. My name is Takeya from Japan. In Japan case, most of the institutional structure is guided by taking the lead by the government, lead them. So in the insurance system also, public, how to say, housing loan by the government leadership combined with the flood insurance system. Only with the housing loan plus flood insurance system is combined because of the more than 50% of the population located in the floodplain. So this is very common issues. But on the other hand, government try to give the incentive to the private sector, like a more massive industrial companies and so on, which they prepare for the disaster risk reduction or disaster response or flood fighting. They will give some incentive low ratio of the private loan from the government bank. So that is one incentive too. Thanks.
I would say that insurance is an emerging story. You know, it's a developing story. You know, as the country's economy grow, the insurance coverage starts growing. It's a reflection of the depth and diversity of economy. At the same time, it's also a matter of public policy support. When the government starts supporting insurance by encouraging and incentivizing insurance products and services, you find that there is a growing insurance market. If you just compare India 10 years back with the insurance coverage right now, there is a big change. Both on the supply side as well as the demand side. So it's not something that could be imposed, but over a period of time it evolves, and right kind of public policies is definitely a big support or big incentive. Or, Bhutan is a great case, a country not very developed, but the government of Bhutan has introduced compulsory mandatory housing insurance. All the houses are insured. And it works, it works because all the homeowners do receive some amount of assistance after if they have a housing damage. And there are several other countries. World Bank set up the big, Turkish Catastrophic Insurance Program, TCIP. I think it has also helped increase the insurance coverage in Turkey. So the story here is a growing story, and it's something that needs to be supported with more pools, larger pools, more kind of risks being covered, and right kind of public policies. Thank you.
If I could ask colleagues here, one of the questions that's emerging is how do you actually embed resilience as a major focus in, or mainstreaming resilience into planning, into setting standards, into the regulatory framework? What have you seen from your country's perspectives? How is that emerging? Who's leading that charge? How do you introduce it into a country's budgeting, planning, regulatory framework? Is it that we have to wait for several disasters to happen? What would you say from your perspective of how to make this happen, please?
I'll speak about this issue which you raised from the perspective of India. I belong to a state called Bihar, Indian state of Bihar. The government is willing to provide funds and finances for resilient infrastructure. But the issue which appears to me most important is the lack of capacity. We do not have capacity to build resilient infrastructure. And the second one is the access to technology. This access to technology within the framework of a federal country at the state level, we call it state, at the state level, is quite limited. So there's a need of interface between the capacity which the central government has with the state governments. If there's the interface, there's a cooperation, then certainly, in my state at least, I know that finances are not a problem, but certainly capacity is a problem. Access to technology is a really problem. After Sendai framework, we have developed what is known as DRR roadmap. I think my state is the first, NDMA recognizes that also. It's the first state to develop a roadmap. But when I discuss with my colleagues in works department, we call the works department, they do not know how to build a resilient road. They do not know how to build a resilient highway. I talked with the NHI people. They do not know how to go about it. So finances may be an issue, but in my state it's not an issue. But capacity and access to technology, of course, is an issue. Thank you.
Some more thoughts on that, please? Yeah, go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Stefan Kohler from UNOPS. I think it's a really important question that you've raised, and I think it begs another question which we've had to deal with, and that is the question of who owns resilience. Because I think if there is no ownership of this agenda, we have this problem of it kind of belongs to everyone and it belongs to no one. And an example that I won't elaborate on too much, but some work we've been doing with the government of Afghanistan, and I believe it's quite a unique approach, is we are actually trying to answer that question of who owns the resilience agenda in the country. And what we've done is we've done some work with what was the Afghan National Disaster Management Authority, and the idea is to reshape that into a National Resilience Authority. And that has some interesting implications of how you deal with this whole issue of resilience. But I think the key message is that it actually creates ownership of this agenda, and somebody needs to own it. Because if nobody owns it, then all those separate initiatives that happen in different ministries and different agencies are not coherent and they get lost. So I think that's quite a critical point to make, is that we really have to understand who owns this agenda. Thank you.
can I have some reflections on these 2 points that have been raised? One is, where does capacity come from? And the other is, in a political economy where choices are being made in public policy, who owns resilience? Can I get some reflections on these points, please? So one on building the capacity, and the other one is embedding in a political economy the ownership of resilience as an objective, right? And then I'll come to you. A mic here, please.
With respect to the capacity issue, I think we need to think carefully about the case of countries which are growing at 7 or 8% a year. This places, a strain on the capacity of local administrations in particular to do the sort of careful planning, assessment, studies and evaluations which Kamal was mentioning to ensure that resilience is really part of the DNA of all new infrastructure. So I think there's a kind of a conflict at that level between the sort of case for expediency, where local administrations need to actually deliver large volumes of infrastructure over a very, very quick space of time to meet demands, and what is actually the sort of requirement of the studies and evaluation that need to happen to build resilience in. So even when you have a clear owner of resilience at the national level, which from my perspective normally should sit in an economics, finance or planning ministry, which is actually distributing the checks around to the sectors and the local administrations, I think the key challenge is actually how one translates that into capacities to actually plan and implement at the local level in cases where, actually paradoxically, the more money we have to invest actually makes the task more difficult. I studied urban planning about 40 years ago, and no one taught us ever how to plan for cities which were growing at 8, 9, or 10% a year.
What I worry about what you have just said is this is an age-old problem. A national objective, implementation locally. I don't think we've solved that story, and now we're going to put resilience on top of it. Folks, this is not going to be easy, huh? Sir, you wanted to comment. Right behind you.
My name is Mustafa Mehajak.
One thing I've discovered about conferences is the technology of mics is a puzzle.
My name is Mustafa Mehaja, Director General National Emergency Management Agency in Nigeria. There are two issues that restrict implementation of all what could be decided or discussed here. Since the concept was initiated of disaster risk reduction, we have all policies or understandings established. We have national contingency plan in place, but no funding. We have the disaster risk reduction department domiciled in the National Emergency Management Agency. We have all other apparatus that needed to be done. But the issue of political will and political implications of decisions make serious constraint locally. So I don't know where and how we could find a way of implementing these frameworks decided, particularly the Sendai framework, how it can be domesticated, because this issue of disaster resilience infrastructure construction locally is an issue that borders around policy implementation, fund And I don't know, these are issues that are very, very difficult to be resolved here. So these are issues that I suggest that need to be looked into, find a way of solving these issues. You can say so much, but to implement them or to get them practically realized is the issue, I think, of concern in our country.
Can I go back to something that Kamal raised, and I heard it in Mr. P.K. Mistra's comments also. Kamal ended his PowerPoint presentation by saying, what we need is an intellectual infrastructure. And I think what he was provoking here was the idea that, and reflecting what Mr. P.K. Mistra said, do we know enough about setting standards? Do we know about how to budget for resilience? Do we know what kind of regulatory framework we need, what enforcement we need? That if we can create an intellectual infrastructure where we learn from each other, this is going to be a very, very important step towards influencing nations to think about resilience. Can I get some reactions from colleagues here? Is that a binding constraint in the story of the development of resilience? And second, any thoughts on your side? How does one create an intellectual infrastructure? Mind you, I'm hearing very clearly it's not about an academic intellectual infrastructure. It's an infrastructure that will actually provoke changes in implementation. That's what I think Kamal's challenge is. So can I get a reaction? Is this the binding constraint we need to worry about? And what lessons would you put on the table of how to get this going? Over there.
Junaid, I'm building on your comment that there is a world of infrastructure and resilience. Ideally, these should not be two worlds. Actually, if somebody design a infrastructure, by virtue of engineering principles, it should last the intended purpose. But one overarching thing which is troubling is the weak sector management of infrastructure itself in several developing countries. If the management of the infrastructure sector itself is weak, then it cannot be that the resilient infrastructure could happen. So we have to see this problem two ways. First is the technology and the design standards, which Mr. Kishore had also mentioned. Another is the implementation of those standards on the ground, which is also troubling us. What happens is actually poorly designed infrastructure or built infrastructure will fail prematurely even without extreme events are not happening. And third thing actually with colleagues from Bihar also mentioned is the institutional capacity to deliver those. So we have to see the problem in three ways. First of all, doing more research to find out resilient infrastructure. Second is the implementation of the existing standard itself and the institutions. So these three pillars we have to build on just to resolve this problem.
Okay, so all of this was really just nothing more than a way for us to get ready for the next 2 days of conversation. So I'm going to, because of timing, just conclude here. Lot of themes, and I hope you'll get a chance to talk about the themes of how to build capacity, themes of how to create ownership of the resilience agenda, themes of how to create exchanges between countries on what we're learning about setting standards, enforcements, themes of how you bring new elements of finance. These are all different themes, and I think that this conference has a chance to really push the resilience agenda onto the mainstream agenda, saying the two cannot be kept separate anymore. And how you do it, I think, is something that only you who have been practitioners and thinkers of this area can really put on the table. Excellency, over to you.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the session has been provoking, but it is setting the agenda for what will happen in the next few hours and the following day also. What came out clear is that just like Mr. Kamal Kishore talked about interdependency of our infrastructure, there is again interdependency of our disciplines, planners, engineers, financial merchants, and what have you. Then what we need to sign on to is international ethical standards for all of us to be able to deliver on our mandates. I want to thank you sincerely for being active participants in this session. I look forward to seeing you in other sessions that will bring out the best of this international workshop. Thank you and good afternoon.